Charles X Gustav, also Carl Gustav, was King of Sweden from 1654 until his death. He was the son of John Casimir, Count Palatine of Zweibrücken-Kleeburg and Catherine of Sweden. After his father's death he also succeeded him as Pfalzgraf. He was married to Hedwig Eleonora of Holstein-Gottorp, who bore his son and successor, Charles XI. Charles X Gustav was the second Wittelsbach King of Sweden after the childless King Christopher of Bavaria, and he was the first king of the Swedish Caroline era, which had its peak during the end of the reign of his son, Charles XI. He led Sweden during the Second Northern War, enlarging the Swedish Empire. By his predecessor Christina, he was considered de facto Duke of Åland before ascending to the Swedish throne. His numbering as Charles X derives from a 16th-century invention. The Swedish King Charles IX chose his numeral after studying a fictitious history of Sweden. This king was the fourth actual King Charles, but has never been called Charles IV, heir to the throne. In his early childhood, raised in the Swedish court alongside Queen Christina, he received an excellent civil education. Later, Charles X learned the art of war under Lennart Torstensson, being present at the Second Battle of Breitenfeld and at Yankowitz. From 1646 to 1648 he frequented the Swedish court, supposedly as a prospective husband of his cousin the Queen Regnant, Christina of Sweden. But her insurmountable objection to wedlock put an end to these anticipations, and to compensate her cousin for a broken half-promise she declared him her successor in 1649. Despite the opposition of the Privy Council headed by Axel Oxenstierna, in 1648 he gained the appointment of commander of the Swedish forces in Germany. The conclusion of the Treaties of Westphalia in October 1648 prevented him from winning the military laurels he is said to have desired. But as the Swedish plenipotentiary at the Executive Congress of Nuremberg, he had an opportunity to learn diplomacy, a science he is described as having quickly mastered. As the recognized heir to the throne, his position on his return to Sweden was dangerous because of the growing discontent with the Queen. He therefore withdrew to the Isle of Åland until the abdication of Christina on 5 June 1654 called him to the throne. Early days as king, Charles Gustav was crowned on 7 June 1654, the day after Christina abdicated. The beginning of Charles X's reign concentrated on the healing of domestic discords and on the rallying of all the forces of the nation round his standard for a new policy of conquest. On the recommendation of his predecessor, he contracted a political marriage on 24 October 1654 with Hedwig Eleonora, the daughter of Frederick III, Duke of Holstein-Gottorp. He was hoping to secure a future ally against Denmark. The Riksdag, which assembled at Stockholm in March 1655, duly considered the two great pressing national questions, war and the restitution of the alienated crown lands. Over 3 days a secret committee presided over by the king decided the war question. Charles X easily persuaded the delegates that a war against Poland appeared necessary and might prove very advantageous, but the consideration of the question of the subsidies due to the crown for military purposes was postponed to the following Riksdag. In 1659 he proclaimed severe punishment for anyone hunting in the Royal Game Reserve in Ottenby, Åland, Sweden, where he had built a long dry stone wall separating the southern tip of the island. Second Northern War. War in Poland-Lithuania. On 10 July 1655, Charles X left Sweden to engage in a war against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in what became the Second Northern War. By the time war was declared, he had at his disposal 50,000 men and 50 warships. Hostilities had already begun with the occupation of Dunnaburg in Polish Livonia by the Swedes on 1 July 1655. Then on 21 July 1655, Swedish army, under Arvid Wittenberg, crossed into Poland and proceeded towards the encampment of the Greater Poland. Levy of the nobility encamped among the banks of the Notek River, with some regular infantry for support. On 25 July the Polish noble levy army capitulated, and the voivodeships of Poznan and Kalisz placed themselves under the protection of the Swedish king. Thereupon the Swedes entered Warsaw without opposition and occupied the whole of Greater Poland. The Polish king, John II Casimir of Poland of the House of Vasa, eventually fled to Silesia after his armies had suffered defeats. A great number of Polish nobles and the personal armies joined the Swedes, including the majority of the famous winged hussars. Many Poles saw Charles X Gustav as a strong monarch who could be a more effective leader than John II Casimir. Meanwhile, Charles X Gustav pressed on towards Kraków, which the Swedes captured after a 2-month siege. The fall of Kraków followed a capitulation of the Polish royal armies, but before the end of the year a reaction began in Poland herself. On 18 November 1655 the Swedes invested the fortress monastery of Czestochowa, but the Poles defended it, and after a 70 days siege the Swedish besiegers had to retire with great loss. This success elicited popular enthusiasm in Poland and gave rise to a nationalistic and religious rhetoric concerning the war and Charles X. He was depicted as tactless and his mercenaries barbaric. His refusal to legalize his position by summoning the Polish Diet and his negotiations for the partition of the very state he affected to befriend, awoke a nationalistic spirit in the country. In the beginning of 1656, King John II Casimir returned from exile and the reorganized Polish army increased in numbers. By this time Charles had discovered that he could more readily defeat the Poles than conquer Poland. What is described as his chief object, the conquest of Prussia, remained unaccomplished, and a new Swedish adversary arose in the Elector of Brandenburg, Frederick William I. Alarmed by the ambition of the Swedish king, Charles forced the Elector, albeit at the point of the sword, to become his ally and vassal, but the Polish national rising now imperatively demanded his presence in the south. For weeks he engaged in the pursuit of Polish divisions engaged in guerrilla tactics in the snow-covered plains of Poland, penetrating as far south as Jarosław in Ruthenian voivodeship, by which time he had lost 2/3 of his 15,000-men army with no apparent result. In the meantime, the Russians signed a ceasefire with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and then pursued a campaign in Livonia and laid siege to Riga, the second largest city in the Swedish realm. Charles's retreat from Jarosław to Warsaw almost ended with disaster, for he returned with the fragments of his host. His army was trapped by the Polish-Lithuanian armies, amidst 3 converging armies, in a marshy forest region intersected in every direction by well-guarded rivers, is considered one of his most brilliant achievements. But on the 21st of June 1656 the Poles retook Warsaw, and 4 days later Charles was obliged to purchase the assistance of Frederick William I. By the Treaty of Marienburg, on 28 to 30 July the combined Swedes and Brandenburgers, 18,000 strong, after a 3 days battle, defeated John Casimir's army of 40,000 at Warsaw. However, the Polish-Lithuanian forces promptly withdrew with no large losses and apparent strong will to fight another day. while Swedish host reoccupied the Polish capital again, causing much destruction to the city and its inhabitants. However, this feat of arms did not have the desired result for Charles, and when Frederick William compelled the Swedish king to open negotiations with the Poles, they refused the terms offered. The war resumed, and Charles concluded an offensive and defensive alliance with the Elector of Brandenburg, which stipulated that Frederick William and his heirs should henceforth possess the full sovereignty of East Prussia. War on Denmark-Labius involved an essential modification of Charles's Baltic policy, but the alliance with the Elector of Brandenburg had now become indispensable for him on almost any terms. The difficulties of Charles X in Poland are believed to have caused him to receive the tidings of the Danish declaration of war on the 1st of June 1657 with extreme satisfaction. He had learned from Torstenson that Denmark was most vulnerable if attacked from the south, and he attacked Denmark with a velocity which paralyzed resistance. At the end of June 1657, at the head of 8,000 seasoned veterans, he broke up from Bromberg south of Pomerania and reached the borders of Holstein on the 18th of July. The Danish army dispersed and the Swedes recovered the Duchy of Bremen. In the early autumn, Charles's troops swarmed over Jutland and firmly established themselves in the duchies, but the fortress of Frederiksodde held Charles's smaller army at bay from mid-August to mid-October, while the fleet of Denmark, after 2 days' battle, compelled the Swedish fleet to abandon its projected attack on the Danish islands. The position of the Swedish king had now become critical. In July, Denmark and Poland-Lithuania concluded an offensive and defensive alliance. Still more ominously for the Swedes, the Elector of Brandenburg, perceiving Sweden's difficulties, joined the League against Sweden and compelled Charles to accept the proffered mediation of Oliver Cromwell, Coenraad van Beuningen and Cardinal Mazarin. The negotiations founded, however, upon the refusal of Sweden to refer the points in dispute to a General Peace Congress, and Charles received encouragement from the capture of Frederiksodde, 23 October 24, whereupon he began to make preparations for conveying his troops over to Funen in transport vessels. But soon another and cheaper expedient presented itself. In the middle of December 1657 began the Great Frost, which would prove so fatal to Denmark. In a few weeks the cold had grown so intense that the freezing of an arm of the sea with so rapid a current as the small belt became a conceivable possibility, and henceforth meteorological observations formed an essential part of the strategy of the Swedes. March across the belts. On the 28th of January 1658, Charles X arrived at Hadslev in South Jutland. His meteorologists estimated that in a couple of days the ice of the Little Belt would become firm enough to bear even the passage of a mail-clad host. The cold during the night of the 29th of January became most severe, and early in the morning of the 30th the Swedish king gave the order to start, the horsemen dismounting on the weaker spots of ice and cautiously leading the horses as far apart as possible, until they swung into the saddles again, closed the ranks and made a dash for the shore. Swedish arms quickly overpowered the Danish troops lining the opposite coast and won the whole of Funen with the loss of only 2 companies of cavalry, which disappeared under the ice while fighting with the Danish left wing. Pursuing his march, Charles X, with his eyes fixed steadily on Copenhagen, resolved to cross the frozen Great Belt also. However, he accepted the advice of his chief engineer officer Erik Dahlberg, who acted as pioneer throughout and chose the more circuitous route from Svendborg by the islands of Langeland, Lolland and Falster, in preference to the direct route from Nyborg to Korsør, which would have had to cross a broad, almost uninterrupted expanse of ice. A council of war, which met at 2 o'clock in the morning to consider the practicability of Dahlberg's proposal, dismissed it as hazardous. Even the king wavered, but when Dahlberg persisted in his opinion, Charles overruled the objections of the commanders. On the night of the 5th of February the transit began, the cavalry leading the way through the snow-covered ice, which quickly thawed beneath the horses' hoofs so that the infantry which followed after had to wade through half an ell of sludge, facing the risk that the ice would break beneath the feet. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, with Dahlberg leading the way, the army reached Grimstad in Lolland without losing a man. On the 8th of February, Charles reached Falster. On the 11th of February he stood safely on the soil of Zealand. A Swedish medal struck to commemorate the transit of the Baltic Sea bear the inscription, Natura hoc debuit uni. Sweden had achieved a rare war exploit. In Sweden considered to be matched only by the crusade of the Livonian Order led by William of Modena to conquer Saaremaa in January 1227 and, afterwards when two Russian armies crossed the frozen Gulf of Bothnia from Finland to mainland Sweden in March 1809 during the Finnish War. It is believed that the effect of this achievement on the Danish government found expression in the Treaty of Tastrup on the 18th of February, and in the Treaty of Roskilde, whereby Denmark sacrificed a great part of her territory to save the rest. However, Charles X continued the war efforts against Denmark after a council held at Gottorp on the 7th of July, even though he was in defiance of international equity. Without warning, Denmark was attacked a second time. On the 17th of July he again landed on Zealand and besieged Copenhagen with its King Frederick III of Denmark. But Copenhagen repelled a major assault and managed to hold out long enough for the Dutch fleet under Lieutenant Admiral Jacob van Wassenaar-Oppedam to relieve the city, defeating the Swedish fleet in the Battle of the Sound on the 29th of October 1658. Jutland had been reconquered by Denmark's allies, Poland and Brandenburg, and in 1659 Danish forces liberated the island of Funen in the Battle of Nyborg. As Baltic trade was vital to the Dutch economy, they made clear to Charles they wouldn't allow Sweden to control the Sound. The estates in Gothenburg. Charles X consented to reopen negotiations with Denmark, at the same time proposing to exercise pressure upon his rival by a simultaneous winter campaign in Norway. Such an enterprise necessitated fresh subsidies from his already impoverished people, and obliged him in December 1659 to cross over to Sweden to meet the estates, whom he had summoned to Gothenburg. The lower estates protested the imposition of fresh burdens, but were persuaded by Charles' illness and death. Soon after the estates opened on the 4th of January 1660, Charles X Gustav fell ill with symptoms of a cold. Ignoring his illness, he repeatedly went to inspect the Swedish forces near Gothenburg, and soon broke down with chills, headaches and dyspnea. On the 15th of January, court physician Johann Costa arrived, and in medical error mistook Charles X Gustav's pneumonia for scorbut and dyspepsia. Costa started a cure, including the application of multiple enemators, laxatives, bloodletting and sneezing powder, while after 3 weeks the fever eventually was down and the coughing was better. The pneumonia had persisted and evolved into a sepsis by the 8th of February. On the 12th of February, Charles X Gustav signed his testament. His son, Charles XI of Sweden, was still a minor, and Charles X Gustav appointed a minor regency consisting of 6 relatives and close friends. Charles X Gustav died the next day at the age of 37. Family. Charles X had one legitimate child by Hedwig Eleonora of Holstein-Gottorp. His successor Charles XI. By Marta Alitz he had an illegitimate son, Gustav Carlson, who became Count of Boringe and Lindholmen Castle in Scania. He also had a number of other children by different women before his marriage. Ancestors.